Hello and welcome to today's webcast sponsored by Enel North America, How to Build No-Cost On-Site Solar and Battery Storage Projects. I'm Katie Ryan, Director of Sustainability here at GreenBiz. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Before we begin, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping details, namely how you can make the most out of this platform. So you'll notice up at the top is how to resize the windows. You can make them in the way that you want to maximize the content or the speakers. Down at the bottom, you'll notice buttons that are also super useful. I want to point out the resources button. That's the place where you'll be able to download resources related to this webcast, including the webcast slides. A quick note that we are recording today's session, which is great because it means after the session is over, we'll send out the recording to all registrants and you can go back and watch again the pieces that you kind of wanted to dial back into. Also hoping to make this a really interactive webcast. There are a couple of ways to do that. You have a chat there that you can interact with other attendees, welcome yourself, introduce yourself. And then the ask a question, the Q&A is a place where I'll be grabbing those and helping get those answered from the Enel team. And then don't forget to share what you're learning by tagging us on all the socials so that your learnings go beyond just this group here. So let's get into today's discussion. We're here for an hour to do this interactive webcast, and it's going to all give us the how-to for building on-site clean energy projects. This is not new. Everybody wants on-site energy projects. There's so much upside, including reducing energy cost and emissions, but there's always this show me the money question when it comes to finding upfront capital to make it happen. Luckily, we've got the IRA and new ways of project financing that are opening those doors, and the Enel team knows how to do it well. They're going to walk us through those steps to make all of our on-site energy projects come true. So I'd love to jump into who we are working with today. I'm so excited to have this team from Enel North America. We have Maddie Lee, Senior Policy Analyst, also Andrew Lassard, the Enterprise Account Partner, and don't forget Willie Holmza, our Solutions Engineer. As they go, if you have any questions for that Enel team, don't forget to throw it in the Q&A and then chat, of course, with the attendees in the chat button. And let's get this started. I'm going to pass it over to you, Drew.
Hey, thanks, Katie, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'll definitely underscore what Katie just said. I really enjoy interrupting my colleagues to interject a relevant question to the topic. I find that it is, at least as an attendee myself to webinars, much more engaging to see some live questions come in and to really kind of add some nuance and some customization to some of the slides and stuff that we're talking through in the topic. So certainly please add those to the Q&A as we're going through. I'll be keeping an eye on that. I see that there's quite a significant list of attendees in right now, about 170 folks. I hope some of you are familiar with us at NL, but just to provide a little bit of context, if you're not familiar with us, of the company that you're hearing from today, we're a global energy company. We're based out of Rome. We're poles and wires in a lot of countries in Europe and South America and other places. In North America, NL North America is a business-to-business energy solutions company. So we are providing, some of these on-site solutions that you see in orange here, directly behind the meter, or in curtailment and capacity markets. So demand response programs, that is our largest commercial industrial customer base. That if you are a customer, if you're familiar with us, that may be very likely where you're coming from. We have a fleet electrification and an EV charging division as well. And then obviously we're focused here today on the solar and storage piece of the business and specifically building configurations behind the meter and on site with our customers. The other half of our NL North America is a front of the meter utility scale renewable energy development company primarily. So those PPAs and VPPAs are how those projects become and manifested for our customers in contracts. We are a retail energy supplier in a couple of markets, and then of course we have an advisory group as well that does risk management and portfolio management and utility bill management, things like that. So just to quickly cover who we are and what we do at NL North America. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Maddie to talk about the policy side of this and what has really been going on in the market that's driving demand and interest in building projects.
Thanks so much, Drew. So just to back up before we dive into the specific financing options, we're just going to talk about where we are in the landscape today. How did we get here? What are the pushes and pulls that are getting us to where we need to deploy these systems? And we're going to start with the financing push. So as many of you are probably familiar, the IRA is really the most dominant force in the financing push. We saw about $370 billion in climate and clean energy incentives from this law that was passed last August. Most of this is in the form of tax credits. So this means that all of these different tax credits bring down the investment, operating, and purchase costs of a slew of different clean energy technologies. So whether you have solar and storage and other renewable systems, you have clean hydrogen, you have electric vehicles, home energy systems, all of these have different incentives in the IRA. So it's a big financing push. The second push that we want to focus on today is the policy side. So we're seeing, especially in the United States, a lot of states adopting these 100% clean energy targets. And so that's ultimately pushing states to not only procure these resources themselves, but then within their own borders, companies that are operating these states will want to help contribute to those goals as well. And finally, and I'll also note that of those 23 states, that represents about 56% of the population of the US. So the majority of people in the country now are living in states with these clean energy goals. And finally, we're seeing a private sector push as well. So the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, allows companies to set emissions reductions targets, and over 4,000 companies have set these targets through SBTI. So we're seeing a lot of companies, likely many of yours as well, make these really bold, ambitious goals to match not only the state and the financing incentives, but internal goals as well. So next, we're going to talk about the IRA a little bit in more particular detail. So we're going to focus on one of the specific incentives in the IRA called the ITC, or the Investment Tax Credit. This isn't a new tax credit, but it was extended for 10 years in the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have a lot of policy certainty that we didn't have before this tax credit. And this slide is a little bit wonky in terms of the details, so we're just going to break it down on what you're looking at. So the most important part of this to really take away is this red and the blue bars, and that together mean kind of the base or full credit that your project can get an investment tax credit for without any of the bonus adders. So that means that if your company and we meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, which we can also go into detail if you have any interest in that, you're going to get the 30% ITC. This is even more incentivized by all these 4 green bars you see. So if your project uses a specific content of domestic materials, if it's located in a particular community, especially one that has a certain criteria, or it's a low-income community, you can ultimately get up to 70% of an ITC to offset the cost of your project. So again, the takeaway here is that 30% is a really widely available ITC for most projects out there. And then as you add on these additional factors, you can get up to 70% with the ITC. So that's a really big tax credit investment option for people that was not available before the IRA passed. And what does that mean in practicality, right? So this graph shows exactly that, the cash flows pre-IRA and post-IRA. So you can see pre-IRA, and that's kind of those pink bars at the bottom. Without the IRA, a hypothetical solar and storage project would generate around $37,000 in savings over 20 years. And you can see that final really small pink bar at the end there at year 20. And up until year 20, actually, you don't even have positive savings. Then we look to the blue bars, which are obviously pretty substantial. And you can see that with the IRA, with that 30% tax credit, you're getting not only $6 million in upfront cost savings due to the IRA and ITC, but you ultimately get almost $7 million in savings after 20 years. So you go from $37,000 to $7 million in savings with the ITC. I also note too that on the previous slide, we saw all of those bonus adders. This chart in this graph is the cost savings without any of those adders. So it's still just that 30%. So if you have those bonus adders, you're actually going to get even more in savings, which is really significant. And it's not just the federal level that we're seeing incentives at either. So there's a lot of states that are adding to and fueling this deployment as well. As we talked about, a lot of those states have different clean energy targets. So I want to focus on 4 programs in particular that really are driving the market for these. So first, in California, there's the Distributed Electricity Backup Assets Program, the DEBA program. In Massachusetts, red blue bar graph is mislabeled. It may have been, sorry about that, David. I got a question on the Q&A. Overall, the takeaway on the previous slide is that if it's the blue bars, oh yeah, sorry, that is mislabeled. So yeah, so the blue bars is with the IRA and then the pink bars are without the IRA. Thanks for clarifying. So yeah, so going back to the state incentive programs, we have the DEBA program in California, we have the SMART program in Massachusetts, we have in Illinois a distributed generation incentive program, and then in Connecticut, the Connecticut Green Bank also has a program for solar and storage. I'll also note that this map obviously has more than just 4 states outlined, so that's indicative of not only beneficial state incentive programs, but also states that we've identified as just generally good markets to develop these kinds of projects, so like New York and New Jersey. And we're going to put this all together, everything we just talked about, by discussing the fact that when you combine federal and state incentives, you have significant savings. And then ultimately, when you combine that with financing options that Drew's going to go into in a second, these systems can cost your company nothing in CapEx upfront. So you can see from the DEBA program, stack that with the ITC, you only have a 20% cost left that you can finance as well. And I'll also do one last plug for the DEBA program in particular. So this program is really relevant in the moment. Drew's been working really hard on this program with a lot of our customers. It is a time sensitive and limited program. So we're expecting the funding opportunity to open around January. But if your site is in California, if you're thinking about solar and storage in California, now is really a fantastic time to do that. So if you have any questions, want to look into your project, want to figure out what that means for you, please do reach out to our team and we can talk to you more about that. And then, oh yeah, one last question on the map too, is that the North America map highlighting the province of Ontario, that's correct, is the Canada province highlighted. Thanks. And I will pass it back to Drew to talk a bit more about the financing.
There we go, off mute. Yeah, thank you, Maddie. Appreciate you putting that underscore on the DEBA program there as well. And that is somewhat of an urgent note to jot down if you do have sites there. So turning to part 2 here is really thinking about, you know, if you're talking to any energy solution providers like NL or some of our competitors, you're looking at on-site projects, what are the types of offers or configurations of financing are you going to see? And then secondly, in this part, we're going to unpack exactly how they and us are able to make offers that are really positive business cases. So in addition to the funding, which would be baked into the offers, exactly where do we generate value in these projects? So first of all, the type of offers you're going to see and the financing options that you would consider as a customer are really outlined here in these 3 columns. So, and across these metrics we've tried to describe the nuances between them. So description, value to you as the customer, where the performance risk lies to the project, and then the financial risk as well. So the first option being direct purchase. That would be paying cash, CapEx, directly out of your budget to build these projects on site. You're going to keep 100% of the financial value of the project, so that pink and blue chart we saw earlier, that would all be customer value with none shared with a partner over that period of time. However, that means that you are putting all of your cash out front and putting all of your faith in the market and the operational risk and the performance risk with those 2 things combined. So the value that's generated, you bear all of the risk relative to that 15 or 20 year timeline. And then of course, because it is your cash, you're also bearing all of that financial risk as well to recover it. The middle column there, the fixed payment developer financing, that's really a circumstance where the customer is not going to outlay its CapEx, but the developer would do that. However, recover that through a fixed payment throughout the life of the partnership. So there is going to be some value shared value across both the customer and the partner in that circumstance. But again, because those are fixed payments, the developer is going to kind of have a guaranteed cash flow for the project duration, with the customer bearing the upside and downside of that project performance. The cash is outlaid by the developer. So if that project were to underperform, there is some moderate risk there to the customer as well from a financial payment standpoint, because if the value generated were to be lower than those payments, you'd be kind of in a negative cash flow situation as a customer. The third offer that you may see if you're generating bids on a project is a shared benefit developer finance model. So that is a zero capex option for customers, and we feel like this is the win-win option. By the way, it's typically the kind of project that we would propose, and it is like I said, zero capex upfront from the customer. The project is modeled, so there you can see fairly transparently where the expected value is going to come from over the life of the project. But the performance risk to the customer is much lower in this model. That's basically because you would have a positive performance relative to the current state throughout the life of the project from the customer standpoint. Because the operation of that asset and recovering the capex that was outlaid is really the onus is borne by the developer in that case. So the developer is tied to the performance due to the shared value, the shared value approach and the benefit share approach to this model. So we really feel like that is the kind of project that you'd want to operate. These types of projects where, especially where you're involving a storage asset, you want to see a partner that is tied to the performance of discharging and recharging that battery over the life of the project. You want your developer's outcome to be tied to executing that properly. I'm seeing a couple questions here. I'm going to take a second to take a look at them. Payment option different from the PPA. Yeah, so a PPA approach would be sort of somewhere in between columns 2 and 3. The value that's generated is sort of fixed to that PPA rate, and so you're going to ideally what we see when I'm putting proposals together on that question. When I see a PPA offer, we really are developing and looking for sites where we can generate a PPA offer where we're combining solar and storage that would be below the prevailing current cost of electricity, and then fixing that or having that grow at a fairly low annual rate that would keep that rate below the prevailing electricity cost in the market. So there would be generated savings relative to that avoided cost from day one for the customer. I see another question here. I'm just going to take a moment to take a peek at it. Someone's been hearing that the shared benefit developer financing strategy may not make financial sense since so much of the cost can be offset by IRA incentives. The shared benefit offers, so let's say a 25% benefit share to the customer. So the generated value of that project, and I'm going to actually go to the next slide to kind of show an example of that. The generated value on this chart here is and I'll get to the answer to that question after I explain the chart. If you look at the blue bars really represent a direct financing approach. So you outlay your capex, you have a 4, 5, 6 year period where you're basically negative. You haven't generated enough value from the project yet to recover that capex, and then you start soaring into the green and stacking value. As I mentioned before, how high these blue bars get and how far you go out until you start getting into the positive is relative to performance risk, right? So is the asset, is the combination of solar and storage, discharged and charged properly to generate enough value for the customer in bill savings or in revenues in order to really stack that blue chart up high enough. The gray bars here represent that shared benefit approach. So you're going to, have a lower ceiling in the best case scenario in year 20 relative to a direct financing option, but you're going to have generated value from day one, and you're going to stack that up over the period. there. So the comment there that you're hearing that it may not make as much sense because of the IRA incentives. When we generate a benefit share, so like I said, 25%, that is baking in those ITCs, those tax credits into what we can offer. So if we were to take those out, we may offer only a 5% or a 10%. We may not be able to offer a benefit share at all. The project may not pencil, as we like to say it. So it may not represent a strong business case, objectively speaking, without those tax credits. So the offer we typically make is net of those benefits. And so if we're able to offer the 30% at 20, the 30% tax credit would generate a 25% offer. If you're in a low income area, or we may be able to qualify the project for some of those adders, that may increase to 35 or 40% as a benefit share. So, if you're talking to any folks like NL, the curtain should be able to be pulled back pretty transparently on, what, scenario A versus scenario B look like, as far as those tax credits are concerned and how they're baked into the offers. I haven't read these questions. I'm just going to lean on my team here. Willie or Maddie, do you see anything else I should address before I move on? I don't want to slow down too much, but I also want to integrate these answers as we're going. You can refer to the number of the question if there's something I should really zero in on.
Yeah, I think there's some fair questions around type of technology. We'll likely cover that a little bit later. I think existing storage technology that can be deployed today is the focus.
Number 7, yeah.
Yeah. And then I think 9 we'll get into.
Yeah. And to the NPV question there, I think we do represent offers in an NPV for these options. Again, I think the NPV comparing a direct financed option versus a developer finance is, so I would say you're probably going to be able to see a higher NPV on a direct financed approach, because again, you're capturing a higher blue bar here than a gray bar, in theory, right? So if the battery was operated exactly the same over that 20-year period, the customer would likely have a higher NPV on a project. But I would strongly caveat that to say that these are long timelines, and I think choosing who your partner is to operate that battery and really thinking about how are they incentivized to, take advantage of the tariff structures as they change over time, of new demand response programs as they change over time, and really tapping into all of the potential value streams there. The incentives of the provider who has outcomes that are directly tied to, being innovative and being on top of those programs and really optimizing that battery versus a partner who is getting a fixed payment. To me, you're de-risking a project when you tie your partner's outcomes to really maximizing and optimizing the operation of that battery. So I think you'd have to strongly caveat that NPV that would be higher and put a risk probability against it that, to me, likely leads you towards the shared benefit approach. And I saw a question that we'll address here in a moment about annual consumption levels and what kind of projects make sense. So shifting a little bit to where the value streams come from, there's two sides to this. There's reducing costs and avoiding costs versus increasing revenues and finding revenues. So you have bill savings, peak reduction, things like that, and then you have demand response and incentive earnings as well. So to get into some specifics on what are the avoided costs we really look for, and I'm sure some of you folks are familiar with what these are, but I'll explain them a little bit. So you have kind of two sides to your bill. You have your energy charges and you have your demand charges. And we can use a storage asset to really tap into both sides of the bill. So on the one side, you've got on-peak and off-peak usage. So we can discharge and charge the battery throughout a real-time pricing or an on-peak, off-peak tariff structure in order to shift some of the energy consumption of the site into those off-peak hours or those lower cost hours, depending on how we can maximize energy arbitrage there. So those would be generated savings that would not have otherwise been feasible without this asset. And then secondly, you look at the on-peak demand, or you look at the non-coincident peak demand. Depending on where you are as a site and which utility zone you're in, you have different structures around how that's charged. But what you want to do is use that storage asset to discharge during when we would predict that those coincident peaks are, or those on-peak charges are derived, or try to generally lower that non-coincident site-specific peak so that you're reducing those charges on that side of the bill as well. So those avoided costs become value stacks, and we start to build on an annual basis, how much can we avoid in terms of bill savings and energy costs. The other side of the bill, or the other side of the equation, is really the earnings. You have these curtailment programs all over the country. The map here on the right represents NL's footprint from a demand response standpoint. There are programs in some of the other gray areas that may be utility-specific programs that are operated by a different partner than NL. But where you have sites in those blue areas, there are curtailment programs. I'm sure some of your sites are participating in those. There are also short duration, short notice programs. We generally call those ancillary programs that can be very lucrative, but very challenging from an operational standpoint for a site to participate in. So when you have a storage asset that could take the entire load of a site off of the grid for a period of time, we can use that asset to participate in that program without any operational disruptions, and then generate that revenue as a part of the revenue stack that we would build. And then when you're building something like a PPA price, that's how we're starting to subsidize this project and then lower that PPA rate. So, if your avoided cost rate or your current cost rate might be 8 cents per kilowatt hour, all of these pieces that I just described would go in alongside the ITCs to a proposal, and then maybe be able to generate to you something like a 5-cent PPA rate. So that's how you kind of start to build all of that up into a financial offer that, I would say 10 out of 10 times, Willie and I are working together with customers where, we have to be focused on business cases that are going to beat that, whatever that prevailing rate is in the market. So whether it's a combination of a PPA rate and a shared benefit model, or purely a shared benefit model, it's all kind of, these are important renewable energy assets and flexibility assets, but ultimately we are, profitable businesses that need to see strong business cases at the bottom line. So that's how we get there. And I think I just did my summary without clicking that button, but happy to take more questions there as we move on. But I think Willie's going to bring us into a specific manifestation of projects that we've worked on, so we can kind of see how these actually look when we talk about, how many megawatts of batteries, how many megawatts of solar we're putting in a site, and things like that.
Cool. Thanks, Drew. Yeah, so I think a lot of you have a pretty good idea of why solar and storage is valuable. You guys are all here attending this webinar. But just to highlight, it is really these priorities and challenges that customers and businesses are facing that drive and sort of shape the development of custom projects for these businesses. So the main three things we're really seeing a lot of demand for from businesses across the country are operational cost savings. So as electricity has been quite volatile in the last handful of years, and often a big part of the operational cost stack, customers are really looking for a way to reduce this and also stabilize it over time. Another big one is sustainability. So we are seeing a lot of businesses with pretty ambitious 2030, 2040 carbon reduction goals, whether that's coming internally or from stakeholders and investors. The demand for this has really ramped up, and the IRA has enabled this to sort of be a realistic option for businesses. And then finally, sort of similar to operational cost reduction, but stability, I sort of separate as a separate thing, especially when we're looking at 15, 20 years down the road, being able to know for certain what you'll be paying for electricity on a volumetric basis can be very useful for long-term business planning, especially in an economy that has some ups and downs in the short term. So again, just to highlight on the right side, these are the main challenges and sort of customer desires that behind the meter solar and storage is addressing: increased sustainability, economic predictability, and lowering operational costs. I will relate this quickly back to Maddie's section, where there are a lot of incentives, both federally and statewide, that these initiatives want to help customers meet these needs. So we're all sort of working in the same direction to make this happen. All right, so now I'm going to look at what it actually looks like for a customer's load. Those are all of the sort of goals that we're aiming towards, but what do we need to operationally do in order to actually create the value, create the savings that makes both the developer and the customer save money? So first, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the x-axis being 24 hours in a day. The y-axis is the instantaneous power draw from the customer. So you can think of this as their meter reading at any given moment. We can see that the customer peaks at around 1.3 megawatts, and at night it's around 500 kW, so relatively small site. And we can see this is the bottom financial metrics and energy metrics are what they would consume and pay over the course of a year, given this load profile. So first, the easiest thing to look at is to understand what solar would do to this. So this is largely pretty intuitive. We're seeing that solar starts producing an offsetting load from the customer's utility meter when the sun comes up, peaks around noon to 3 p.m., and goes down in the afternoon. We can see when we look down that this is really offsetting a great portion of the grid consumption. So more than 50% of the load is now coming from this behind the meter asset rather than being purchased from the grid. So we can see substantial energy cost savings on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis. We can see the peak demand reduces some, but as Drew is describing, the dispatchability of a storage asset is really where we can save a lot on the KW portion of the bill, the demand side. So now this is after solar and storage has been installed, it's being optimized effectively. What we're looking at here are really the two red areas. This is what the storage asset would be doing in addition to just letting the solar do its thing. So in the morning, we would reduce this load as businesses start to ramp up before the sun is out. There can be some peaks created there. We can use energy from the storage asset to keep this flat. And then similarly, we'll charge up throughout the day and then again discharge in the afternoon. So looking at the financial and demand implications of this, we can see as we go from load with solar to load with solar and storage, we're really being able to target the demand side of the bill. And we could substantially reduce both the energy portion and the demand portion when we look at solar and storage. So this looks like something that can be applied across the board, and that is technically true. But there are definitely markets and load profiles that reveal more lucrative projects both for the developer and the customer. And those are the ones that we really want to focus on. So this will get to some of the questions, I think, on consumption levels. Major rule of thumb, larger loads reveal more lucrative projects than smaller loads for a variety of reasons. Economies of scale of assets, but also sort of this gets right to the second one. Large customers and large commercial and industrials are generally able to create more nuanced and complicated billing mechanisms with whether it's a utility or a supplier. And these mechanisms really highlight and enable flexible assets to thrive. So this is really where storage comes into play. If you're able to ramp up and down very quickly, we can leverage appealing billing mechanisms rather than, say, a flat dollar per kilowatt hour charge like a residential customer. It's much more complicated and nuanced, and the storage asset can really help out in that regard. The third characteristic to be aware of, I imagine you guys are all pretty tapped into that, but if you see a big demand charge on your bill, that's definitely something that storage can directly look to combat and reduce. The fourth one to highlight here is rather than a bill savings side of things, it's on the revenue generation, as Drew was talking about. So if you're in a jurisdiction, a state, or ISO with a demand response program, that is a value stream that storage can tap into very well. It's much easier to flip a switch on a battery than to shut down operations at a large, whether it's a manufacturing plant or whatever it may be. And then finally, sort of to Maddie's point, if you're in a state with a lot of incentives, let's definitely take a look at that. That will help drive the economics on both the solar and storage side of things. So now I'm going to look at an actual customer that we're in development with.
There,
I'll let
Willie.
Drew. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but I guess I'm jumping back in.
It.
The graphs on slide 20, so I think back, are they flattened to take into account seasonality, end of summertime, or I think they're just illustrative, but to speak to seasonality, maybe just in general around how we model this out.
Yeah, no, I think
just looking
these
at this
are, I don't know. Yeah, we can look at this. This is an example of a single day. In reality, when we look at an opportunity, I guess I would look at 15-minute interval data across the course of a year. I'd understand what the standard operating procedures are, both throughout the week, the weekends, and then also, to your point, seasonally. This also obviously affects the solar generation. So we really do a lot of simulations, understand what we can target the savings on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis. The numbers you see on the bottom are the result of an annual analysis, and we're just showing the load profile across a single day. So really, this analysis is being done 365 times. We're lumping it all together, showing the savings in a simplified way on this chart. But I do think that's a good thing to highlight, Drew, that we are looking at your load on a 15-minute level of granularity across the year, understanding how that correlates with actual grid peak events, which we'll get into in a little bit. Yeah, but this is just an illustrative day. I'm sure there are days in the weekends where it's flat, days in the winter where maybe it spikes with some AC, but that's all accounted for when we're looking at opportunity.
Great. Okay. Yep. That was exactly what I was hoping you would say there. Thank you. So,
cool.
Yeah, no.
Back to you.
Yeah. So the next piece of Willie's section, I'll just do a quick introduction to, because this was based upon one of my customers in the AEP Ohio territory, and so we had a large manufacturing facility there with corporate sustainability goals, as you can see, specializing in parts for automotive, aerospace, and other industrial uses, but looking to really be creative with the site and a significant load, 5 to 8 megawatts. And this was a company that I would say was not familiar with storage and had not looked at storage. There are some other sites for this company in different parts of the country, and it just wasn't markets where storage had been more prevalent and more had come into the market stronger, like California. So when they're thinking about their corporate leadership team saying build as much on-site renewable as you can, they're simply thinking about where can we put solar arrays. And so when they're talking to developers, they're talking to solar developers, and through some of our other products, we did have a relationship with them and said, hey, we could look at this with solar and storage. And a lot of the education that we've talked about in this call, we did with them as well, just to kind of share, here's why storage makes sense and how it can be something that is essentially subsidizing and helping you to build a large scale solar array where you're actually bringing it below your prevailing, electricity cost. And so I'll let Willie kind of step back in here, but in a market like Ohio, you're not going to see solar developed at a positive business case very easily, even with these investment tax credits. So to get to how we got, to a rate that would beat the prevailing market, I'll let Willie kind of explain how the project comes together.
Awesome. Yeah, so just picking up where Drew left off there, I'll again highlight the site qualifications that really made this pencil, both for the developer, us in this case, and the customer. The big one here are the transmission charges. We can reach an agreement with AEP to have a billing mechanism that really targets coincident peaks. The reason they will sort of support this is because it's actually helping stabilize the grid from their perspective. So it's a win-win. And then also DR participation. We enroll this asset in demand response, create a lot of value with the storage asset, and are able to push down the power purchase agreement, the fixed energy rate on the PV production for the customer. I'm going to hop forward here to, I do see a question I do want to answer though. What are some challenges in evaluating the economics of a project? Where do projected economics and actual performance tend to diverge? That's a great question. And that is really a question that gets to who's exposed to the risk of these projects. If we look at this case, Enel is buying over $10 million of asset and operating it. And in this case, the customer is paying this fixed 6.5 cent rate. In this case, the reason the customer is guaranteed to get that 6.5 cent rate. Enel, to make our return on investment, will need to operate this battery very well and effectively to save the customer money and generate revenue. So in this case, if we don't hit the projected revenues or value streams of the storage asset, we don't hit our rate of return. So in this structure, Enel is at risk. We have that risk embedded on our books. To answer your question more technically, I think it's very hard to predict load for a customer if it's not a very stable or consistent load profile. Data centers, great, flat, very predictable. Any sort of cyclical load is also great because we can learn it and start to understand when we can really mitigate costs. But I just wanted to address that quickly, that in most of the structures we try to use, we try to push as much operational risk onto the developer and now as possible. But back to this example. So what does a 6.5 megawatt solar and battery project look like? In this case, we can look at the top-down view. We can see that we got a manufacturing facility on the left side here. In this case, this is ideal. We have a great customer-owned plot of land sitting right next to us. So we're looking at a fixed tilt ground mount design. This array will produce around 8.8 gigawatt hours a year. In this structure, I think this was a question in the chat a while back as well. The customer is holding all the renewable energy credits and green attributes that are associated with this production. That is something that we can customize on a project by project basis, whether it's really sort of back to the two wants and needs of the businesses. Do they want as much sustainability accreditation as possible, or are they looking to save dollars? Finally, if we look at the storage placement, we can see almost 8 megawatts. In this case, it's around 4 storage containers is the easiest way to visualize what that looks like in reality. I'll also note that we can see a substation right down there next to the solar and storage, just sort of emphasizing this is the dream state facility. A lot of these costs are very low install, but obviously we'd go on site, get custom quotes for any facility we're looking at to really understand what it takes to make this project real. So
I think there's a couple
does
of...
all this...
Oh, no, go ahead. I think I'll interject after this slide.
Yeah, no, cut me off whenever.
No, go ahead.
Just to wrap up this case study here, what does all this mean from a dollar standpoint, effectively? So we can highlight year one benefits for the customer. You're getting that 8.8 gigawatt hours of on-site clean electricity. You're paying the developer $570K, so that's the cost of the PPA at that 6.5 cents. but you're saving $700K on what you otherwise would be paying your supplier and AEP, the utility. So that's where the savings of $123,000 really reveal themselves in year one. It's worth noting this is 6.5 cents across 20 years. I expect the price to go up a little bit over 20 years. If it doesn't, you're still protected. But that's how we get to the 20-year project benefits of $5.5 million for the customer and 168 gigawatt hours of on-site generation. So I'll pause there, Drew, before hopping forward, but are there some questions we want to nip right now?
I think there are two that I wanted to address. And one here is appreciate the comment about, that we're addressing both the carbon abatement, i.e. the on-site PV generation, and the cost component. The other piece that this question asks is about the uninterrupted energy supply. And so I think it is worth noting two things when it comes to partnering on these storage projects. One is that this is not a microgrid, and what that would imply is that this can be an islanded asset for, power outages, blackouts, things like that. So we are not building microgrids where if the grid goes down, you've got this asset. And secondly, when we're building storage assets, these are building, as we demonstrated with those charts earlier, financial benefits, and they're not necessarily sized to be a long-term energy supply for a large manufacturing facility like we just walked through. So that 8 megawatts, we wouldn't be able to power for 8 or 10 hours with the battery. We're not building a battery of that size, that long-term storage asset. So it isn't necessarily that kind of, if that's what this question was alluding to, I just want to be clear that is not, that would be a separate type of a project, and we do microgrids. But typically with these sort of projects, we're not building that sort of a project, and it does increase the cost significantly. So just wanted to address that question. The other question I think I saw was with respect to taking advantage of, and this was in the chat, owning multiple properties, using a lower, a smaller consumption site that has all of the space to build, and how you could potentially use that generation to subsidize some of the other portfolio where space is more confined. The challenge with that type of a project is really net metering issues, and really not being a lot of the grids in the and utilities. Really, Willie and Maddie, if you can think of a market where there is enough value by supplying, kind of backfeeding into the grid with excess renewable energy generation, there really isn't a lot of markets, or there aren't really markets where you can generate value, essentially kind of backloading or selling back into the grid, and then kind of using that generated revenue, so to speak, to subsidize some other sites. There are obviously carbon abatement benefits, but from a cost standpoint, there's a lot of risk associated with that, with net metering policies in general. And I think NL is a kind of company that doesn't develop projects where we're backfeeding lots of power if we can help it, because the local tariffs and PUC policy, Public Utility Commission policies, don't tend to be super friendly to that kind of a strategy. But would there be anything else you'd want to add to that, folks?
I think you covered most of it there.
Hearing nothing. And then lastly on this one, what is the decision point for using ground mount installation versus roof versus carport, if you want to throw that in there as well? And Willie, you know that best.
I think this one we did talk with the customer about. The roof, I think in this case, we wanted to maximize size. In this case, looking at the roof, that's quite a bit going on. You also may need a replacement if the end of life is within 10 years. So the ground is sort of a safer play in terms of roof warranties, risk factors in that regard. But I mean, we look at every option, and it's really up to the customer, and we run scenarios for all of these. So it's really case by case what we think is the best case scenario. But in this one, first glance, the ground looks pretty appealing there. So that's how we ended up with this scenario.
In general rule of thumb for ground mount per megawatt, in terms of acres or square footage, I think there was a question about that. I know we have kind of a general rule of thumb for ever so many acres per megawatt.
4 or 5 acres conservatively, I think 4 to 5 acres per megawatt when you're looking at fixed tilt.
That yellow area on the map is probably what, 30 acres ish?
Exactly. I think I said like 30 or 35 in the chat.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed that. Thanks. Cool. Yeah. And then lastly, as far as like developing these projects, our process is we've kind of talked about the front part of building proposals and getting to these numbers, getting to the 15-minute aerial data, really identifying if a project makes sense. And at that point, most folks, and I hate to speak so much about what Anel is doing, but broadly speaking, you get to a term sheet of some kind, a letter of intent. And that's where we would come and have some broad terms on what the project looks like, what's an acceptable outcome. And we go ahead with engineering and development costs. And so to the question with respect to an approval process, impact studies, things like that, those are we do manage those and make sure that permitting is done properly, that, from an engineering, a technical standpoint, as well as an impact study standpoint, we would go through and develop and make sure the project remains feasible as we go through that process, including interconnection with the public utilities and things like that. So those are all kind of part of the post term sheet up to the actual energy services agreement or contract. And that process is arduous, highly technical, does, require us to put some skin in the game and really put some costs down on the table to make sure that these can go forward.
Willie, I know you have maybe a couple of slides left, and then in a couple of minutes, then we'll need to move to the thank yous.
Anyway, I think we can be quick here.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. So we just looked at a project sort of in development. Also wanted to highlight one that has been successfully operating for a handful of years now, that uses the structure that we've been talking about. So this is a pretty cool solar and storage and EV charger project that is operational here in Boston. And it uses the structure of NL finances everything up front. The customer engages in a contract at a fixed PPA rate. And then in this case, we're combining the fixed PPA rate with a storage benefit share of 17%, as you can see on the slide. So again, this is something NL is operating constantly from the storage side of things. And we're expecting to save UMass Boston around $2 million, plus a bunch of clean energy attributes over the course of 20 years, again, with the no CapEx structure. So this makes a lot of sense for someone who doesn't want to invest $5, $10, $15 million today. Cool. So I'll wrap up, and I think we can be very quick here and just go right to Q&A. But again, I just wanted to highlight that these projects are really driven by business needs. So we're looking at cost savings on the OpEx side, operational reliability, and then sustainability has really been a thing we've been asked about a lot in the last couple of years. The key value proposition is the ability to provide this to businesses and customers at zero upfront cost to them, so fully financed, and the savings are realized through a lower PPA rate than the grid or a benefit share agreement where we share in the upside of storage operations. And finally, the structure works many places across the country, but it's very lucrative in Ontario, California, New York, and increasingly now PJM as a market entirely has really emerged as a result of the IRA. So if you're across the country, but especially in these markets, it's definitely worth taking a look at the bill, see if we think solar and storage can attack it. But we'll pause there. And yeah, go to Q&A. I think we can take any questions here.
Well, we can definitely take questions probably afterwards. So the cool thing about this platform is that those questions will all go to Maddie and Willie and Drew. They can follow up even after the event is over. We're now in that part of the time where we get to move to the thank yous. One thing I really enjoyed about today's presentation was being able to interact live as we went through the different scenarios. And so really grateful for all of the questions that have come in. I know we didn't get to all of them, but like I said, we can follow up with you afterwards. And with that, a big thank you, Maddie, Willie, Drew. You guys have clearly done this before. You know your stuff. It was wonderful to get to work with you on this. Also, shout out to my Green Biz teammate, Taylor Flores. She makes everything run so smoothly. So Taylor, thank you. And like I mentioned at the top of the program, you'll be able to watch this again because everybody who registered for this event will get the recording. So you can go back to your favorite parts and also share that with your teammates. Don't forget about the resources button here. This is place where you can grab the slides that were presented today. We also have a couple of other resources. We're including a link to GreenBiz 24. This is one of our big corporate sustainability events that happens in February in Arizona. GreenBiz is also currently doing its professional salary survey. This is a survey we've been doing a long time. It's really helpful in looking at trends and gaps in skills and actions. So please go in. Would love your salary survey information in there as well. If you want to watch any more webcasts, you can catch those at greenbiz.com/webcasts. I'm just so grateful to everybody for joining. Again, thank you so much to Maddie and Willie and Drew. And I hope everybody attending saw themselves in these case studies that were presented, because this is the time. This is the time to do on-site renewable projects. So thank you again. Hope everybody has a wonderful day. Bye.